Joel, over to you.
Good afternoon. I am Joel Fishman, co-president of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Welcome to the September 12 First Monday. These First Monday programs are brought to you by the Public Diplomacy Council of America and the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy. Today's program on disinformation, democracy, and public diplomacy is part of a series that reflects our commitment to excellence and achievement in the professional practice, academic study, and advocacy for public diplomacy. The challenge to counter disinformation is hardly new. Jonathan Swift wrote in 1710 that, and I quote, "As the vilest writer has his readers, so the greatest liar has his believers. And it often happens that if a lie be believed only for an hour, it has done its work. Falsehood flies, and the truth comes limping after it." End quote. That was in 1710. More recently, a wonderful quote with questionable origins is credited to Mark Twain in 1919. Quote, "A lie can travel around the world and back again while the truth is lacing up its boots," end quote. Never mind that Mark Twain died in 1910. We see this as the beginning of a series examining this topic. There is no better way to launch this series than with PDCA member Todd Leventhal. It is our fortune that Todd retired recently as Senior Counter-Disinformation Advisor for the State Department Global Engagement Center after decades of experience advising the rest of us on countering Soviet, Russian, and other disinformation, conspiracy theories, and falsehoods of every available stripe. At times, Todd was the only person in USIA and the State Department doing this valuable work. I have known Todd for most of that time, having met him when we both served in USIA's policy office, where he was wrestling with the infamous Soviet active measures. I was one of many who benefited from Todd's insights. That will continue now in PDCA. Our tech host today is Alastair Somerville, who was also helping to design this series. And now over to you, Todd.
All right, here we go. All right, Joel, thanks very much. Let me try the video again. Here we go. There we go. Finally got it. Thank you so much, Joel. A very kind introduction. We spent many years working together. I fondly remember them. And it's great. I really appreciate the invitation to talk to a lot of old friends out there that I can't see, but I assume are out there, people I've worked with over the years, and some who I don't know, but I'm glad to start to meet. So thank you, Sherry, Alastair, for arranging this. I hope you find it worthwhile. First of all, as Joel said, disinformation is a huge problem. It's been a huge problem forever and a day. But the Soviets and now the Russians have added extra spice and gusto to this. In 1959, the Soviets created a special bureau, Department D, within the KGB, because KGB had disinformation operations. That was their responsibility. Quickly became a service, a larger organization, and then now it's a directorate, which is an even larger organization. So this has grown and grown like Topsy. And we forgot about it for a long time. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the whole government apparatus dealing with this disappeared, with the sole exception of me, I would say. I was the only person left at USIA dealing not with Soviet disinformation anymore, but still with any misinformation, mistaken information, even if it wasn't deliberate. Crazy things like many of you might, or some of you might have heard of this organ trafficking rumor, the baby part story, we called it. It went wild in the world press from 1987 to 1996 when I was bumped in a riff, went back to VOA. But it was a totally untrue story of Americans going to Latin America, adopting or kidnapping children, infants, bringing them back to be killed for their organs. So, life-saving organ transplants on people's natural children. Totally untrue rumor, nothing to it at all except fear. It encapsulated people's fears about this new technology, organ transplantation, had just taken off in the 1980s. And, imaginations run wild and rumors run wild. The Soviets picked up on this, played it. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed, continued for many years. It was unstoppable. It won the most prestigious journalism prize in France in 1994 and in Spain in 1995. A variation of the rumor. Didn't say they were stealing organs, but eyes, which is actually equally impossible to do, corneas. But, the facts were obscure to a lot of people, but the fears were very real. So I got to see this up close and personal for many, many years. And, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to knock these things down. And I would say it's not just disinformation. We saw in the 2016 presidential race, hack and release operations by the Russians, hacking into the DNC and the campaign, Clinton campaign, leaking emails, real stuff, but it was done according to their timetable. They did it for strategic benefit for their own purposes, which were to elect Donald Trump, self-evidently. And the media lapped it up. I mean, they couldn't resist. There was one mea culpa article late in 2016 in the New York Times. Scott Shane wrote it, I think. Said, yeah, we let ourselves be used. Yeah, they did. And this is a free press. It's not going to be suppressed. And we've seen this again and again. So disinformation is a danger, but also the Russian hacking of the increasing amount of information that's online presents, a huge danger going forward. And one that, if you don't have any scruples like the Russian intelligence services, we're going to remain vulnerable. And you can always, get into somebody's email and find out what's going on and publicize it, and the press will run with it. Now, the most important thing to do in countering disinformation is to expose it, because it's morally reprehensible. And it's a fight with truth versus lies, but it's also a fight to expose the moral turpitude, the outrageous, unscrupulous behavior of the other side. And you should aim at, somebody countering disinformation should aim at establishing the truth, but also establishing moral disgust at the people who pursue this and basically, ruin their brand, which leads to less people believing them, but also informs people about better who our opponent is. And, if we had any questions about that, the last 6 months in Ukraine have given us new revelations. My old boss, Herb Romerstein, we'd talk and, lament how people couldn't see the problem. He'd say, don't worry, the Soviets will do something so horrible that everybody will, awaken and, they'll see what their problem is. They'll forget later, but they'll do this. And he was absolutely right. He was a great, great man. It was one of the great pleasures of my life to work with him. First couple of years of my career as a great mentor. So, the most important thing is to expose it. And we saw this perfectly in February when the intelligence community in the United States exposed, they saw these false flag operations the Russians are planning. Let's kill a bunch of people and blame it on the Ukrainians, and then we have an excuse to invade, just like Hitler did to start World War II. He said, a totally mocked up incident and used this as an excuse to invade. So standard operating practices for these kind of guys. But it was perfect to blow their cover, to say they're doing this. And if they do it, they've vindicated us. And if they don't do it, well, they've lost that tool. So this is the way to do it. And I think this was behind the creation, or not the creation of the Global Engagement Center, but the Global Engagement Center had existed since 2010, trying to counter decrease recruitment to violent extremist organizations using messaging. But they were given the additional responsibility in December 2016, countering state-sponsored disinformation. And the idea, I think, was let's expose it. I mean, this is the way you do your business. I'm sorry to say, I think GEC has been an unfortunate disappointment in this regard, and I think we have to think about ways to augment what they're doing. And a lot of this was just simply due to the lack of, we lost an entire generation from 1991 to 2014, when people started paying attention to this issue. Lost an entire generation of people who, for lack of a better word, was just paying attention to this issue. I was doing it, countering disinformation, misinformation, whatnot, whatever came down the pike. But even then, I got tired of it in the late, after 2007, 2008, wasn't working out so well at State Department, and I switched over to more violent extremism type stuff. I was very glad to see the mission come back to state, but when it came back, we suffered from this lack of knowledge about how to do it. And in the first 2 years, the people making the decisions at GEC did not want to do anything publicly. This is, to me, that's totally wrong. This is what you do. This is how you counter it. They didn't see it that way, and they were making the decisions, and I wasn't. So we didn't do anything publicly. And that changed once we got some PD people on board, said, why aren't we writing anything? And I was there, and I said, yeah, let's write something. So I started writing stuff. We didn't really have a team. I started writing these dispatches. We sent a couple out for pre-reading on how do you counter disinformation, what I'd learned over the years. And I wrote 14 of them in a couple of years, or 2.5 years. So that's good, but it wasn't, that's just, that's not a full-fledged operation. We finally got a Russia team going and producing stuff, but the website, Disarming Disinformation, and it's on state.gov. I recommend that you take a look at it. We've got stuff there now, all the dispatches I wrote, other reports and whatnot. But it took more than 5 years to get that up. And a lot of it was the impetus of, hey, we got a war going on in Ukraine. What are you doing to counter Russian disinformation? Oh, well, here's what we're doing. So at least we've got that. And then a couple, 3 weeks ago, August 24th, they finally got on Twitter. A little late to the game, but, better late than never. And I would just contrast this to an earlier operation, which actually wound up going nowhere. It got killed after 8 months. But I was asked to head a small counter-disinformation team in IIP, International Information Program, which is now part of Global Public Affairs. But back then it was a separate bureau. And I had a couple people working for me, a very good researcher, spoke Russian, native Russian, and a very good writer. And we all worked in the same room, and I taught them, look, let's all work on an article and teach as you go. That's the best way to learn. Master-apprentice relationship. And they learned a lot, and we produced about 30-something stories for a website in 2015, and it got killed, right? We're ready to launch around Labor Day, and all of a sudden the Undersecretary, Public Diplomacy, Public Affairs, who had blessed this 8, 9 months earlier, said, yeah, I've got concerns. And, people said, well, what are your concerns? Well, they were never articulate. So it was a bit Kafka-esque, where, what's going on here? But what's going on was the plug was pulled on the project. I don't know why, but I think it shows the unreliability of the State Department, quite frankly, to act as a messenger. And I think there's an inborn or not inbred, but a intrinsic conflict having the public diplomacy counter-disinformation mission in the State Department, as it has been default since the merger of USIA and state in 1999. We're much better off having it in USIA. USIA was a communications agency. That was right in line with what we did. And I was at USIA, from 87 on to 96. I got bumped in a riff, sent back to VOA. But people all over the world, our public affairs officers, information officers, even cultural officers would pitch in, and we're all a team. I send guidance out and they, bang on the desk of whoever had run a false story or whatever. They knew how to deal with it because they were there on the ground. I could research the stories from Washington, save them the trouble, and they were the action on. It was perfect. And those people still exist, but we're operating in a State Department culture. And whereas public affairs at USIA had been my best ally in getting the story out, do stories in AP World and whatnot, and get the story out, Foreign Press Center. At State, quite frankly, public affairs was not friendly to this mission. I remember in 2006, something like that, I had a website up, countering misinformation at State, and ABC got, caught wind of it, wanted to do a story on it. Public affairs, no, we're not going to do it. Why? Well, we don't do pieces on individuals. And 3 weeks later, I see a story in the New York Times on a State Department translator, just on him. So, you couldn't get an honest answer, in my opinion, out of PA about why they didn't want to do it, but it was damn well sure they didn't want to do it. They were hostile to the mission. Once I was a person in London who dealt with the Arab press, asked me to come speak to them, which I gladly did. She told me later PA had called her and tried to get the thing canceled. And she said, why? He says, well, he's a zealot. And she repeated this to me. And I said, well, I'd have to say that's true. I am. And she goes, but a zealot in countering disinformation? I said, yeah. Like, what's the problem? But PA has a problem with this. And I think it's best exemplified by a sad story but an illustrative story in 1987. We were exposing Soviet disinformation at the time. State was, USIA was. State had these great reports they did once a year on Soviet active measures, 120 pages, good stuff. And the Soviets were backing down. They were very weak at the time. They realized they had lost the Cold War. They didn't want confrontation. They wanted to eliminate the enemy image, as they call it, to get us to decrease our military spending and our confrontational policies under Reagan. And they were successful in that. But we posed them a challenge. We just exposed the nasty stuff they were doing, not just the baby part story, but, Jonestown, remember the horrible massacre down in Jonestown? Oh, that was a crime of the CIA. All sorts of stuff, just anything that was going on. There was a lake that had noxious fumes that every once in a while would, there'd be a temperature inversion and noxious fumes would kill people at Lake Nyos in Cameroon. Well, the CIA did that. It was the same thing. It was just standard operating procedure for them. So we forced them, by exposing this, to give it up if they wanted to keep their smiley face image in the West. And they did it, starting in August 1987, AIDS disinformation, and then other disinformation over the next 6 or 8 months. But in the midst of this, Secretary Schultz travels to Moscow, meets with Gorbachev. Gorbachev's got the State Department report. He's marked it all up. He's complaining to Schultz. How can you say this about us? And Schultz stands up and says, all this bum dope about AIDS, what do you expect? But then he gets back and he tells INR, I don't want to see any more of these reports, right? These are the reports and the USIA efforts that are getting the Russians, the Soviets, to stop their crude anti-American disinformation in their press and their media. We're having, that's the best possible, metric you could have. But nobody heard of metrics back then, but we had it. And he wanted to stop it. because he didn't understand how important it was. And that's, but it disturbed his meeting with Gorbachev. It made it unpleasant. Maybe he thought it might have derailed it. He had all sorts of important things to do. Didn't derail it. Gorbachev dealt with him. But that's the tension you have with an organization that's a private diplomacy organization that's always going to take precedence over public diplomacy. So my suggestion, quite frankly, is that we augment what Global Engagement Center is doing with a congressionally mandated and funded and maybe private funded, I don't know, something like a NED, like a National Endowment Center, except to counter disinformation. And NED does a lot of funding of projects. GEC is actually already doing a lot of that. That's fine. They're doing it. You don't have to duplicate that. But I would have an organization that made its purpose to get stories countering disinformation into the press, because that's where you make your money in this business. That's where you achieve liftoff. That's when you get known, and that's when the phone starts ringing. And that's what you want. You got to use the media to get the story out. It doesn't help to have it on a website if the media doesn't report. That's purely an internal. Otherwise, it's just internal kudos. So that's my, in brief, recommendation from what I've seen. We've been slow out of the gates. You need people who are experts talking to the press. And one of the problems at GEC and State Department in general is the experts who do the dog work don't talk to the press. The big bosses talk to the press. And, the experts write up the talking points, but if you deviate from the talking points in the Q&A, the people who have been briefed on it and reading from the briefing points don't know what to say. When I did it, I was the chief cook and bottle washer. I was the only person countering disinformation, misinformation for 15 years. I had to do all the dog work myself, but that was great because when you talk to the press, you could remember things. I can remember Lake Nyos from 35 years ago. I can remember baby parts. I could talk for an hour on baby parts, but you got to have an expert spokesperson, both those roles together. You're not going to get it in GEC. You're not going to get it at state. We need another outlet. I could go longer and go into some more details. The other thing is, we can do so much more with algorithms now. Everything is online. Like the Ghanaian Times used to be a lot of disinformation. That now you can find it online, but don't go there because it's like they're going to hack you if you go there. But I did a dispatch on the Lithuanians. What they did, dispatch number 1, find it on the disarming disinformation website. People build algorithms, search for terms, whatever you want. Then you can research and then you can get it to the newspaper. But you don't have to have government organization do that. Whereas 35 years ago, you had to. There was nobody else who knew what was going on. We knew what was going on. Soviets knew what was going on. The Brits, other people paying attention. But there was no way somebody out of government could know what was going on in countries all over the world. Now we can capture that information and we can avoid the pitfalls of trying to speak from a State Department platform by having private individuals do it. And just one other thing, the EU versus disinformation site. It's a great site on disinformation. It doesn't do anything to counter, except says, oh, this was a conspiracy theory, or this is, obviously not true. It wasn't designed to counter. I know Jakub Kalinski, the guy who put it together, a Czech journalist, is now with the Hybrid Center in Finland. He's a great guy, but he was very frustrated that nobody would take him seriously about Soviet Russian disinformation. So he says, let's just, let's show him in spades. So it does. It does a great job, but you don't see it quoted in the press because it doesn't focus on countering. Whereas when I got into the business in '87, it was like, you got a request in the field, they want to know how to counter it. So that's what I learned over the years. And that's what I'd like to see other people doing. And we can do it, but it just requires a separate initiative, in my opinion. So that's it. I don't want to talk for too long. I'm sure a lot of people have questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Todd. I have a couple of questions. Your suggestion of a Quango type organization, quasi NGO organization like NED, if the people in that organization were to develop the talking points or the rejoinders, you said that it's only designated spokesmen who deal with the press or with the media.
At stake.
How would that, having a semi-private organization developing talking points, in your mind, or according to your suggestion, how would they relate to those spokesmen?
It wouldn't relate at all. It'd be an independent organization, ideally. I mean, obviously, it depends on how it's formed, what it says you can do and not do. But I think it needs independence. It shouldn't have to get sign off or approval from state PA to speak to the press. It's not a government organization.
Okay, and social media, that has made a huge difference in disinformation. What is the Global Engagement Center doing with social media? Do we have our own algorithms?
Well, there's a research and analysis section. And I should say that GEC is over 100 people. And they have, they still have the Countering Violent Extremism missions. I don't know exact numbers, but there's a Russia team, a China team, Iran team. Then there's a research and analysis people. There's people who deal with funding NGOs to work in that. That's very important work. So the program office. So I don't have I wasn't in management. So I know the Russia team best. But, all this is important work. But the work of exposing disinformation, that's social media is just, as I say, the GEC just got their Twitter account in late August. So, it's laid out of the blocks. It's obviously hasn't been emphasized.
Okay, finally, one more question.
Sure.
We have our own domestic disinformation problems.
Absolutely.
Over 25% of the adult population in this country believes the big lie. That's astounding.
Yeah.
How does that affect the credibility of what we're trying to do?
Well, look, your credibility is going to be affected by what you say. I mean, obviously, ever since the Trump era, the credibility of the United States has suffered. And you can't, we don't know what's going to happen in the next presidential election. So we can't just say it's in the past. But there's nothing we can do about that. And if you're countering disinformation, you're going to be judged on what you say more than, a global thing like you live in a country that had a president that, had a tenuous relationship with the truth. And, you can dodge that. But it's a problem, it's there. But I think the most important thing is any organization like this should focus not on, you haven't raised this, but I'll insert it, should focus not on domestic disinformation, which is a horrible rat's nest of, who said what, but on foreign disinformation. We should focus on the Soviets, or the Russians rather, Chinese, Iranians, that's fine, others, Cubans, whoever, but keep it offshore. And even though it impacts here, but don't start taking sides with internal debates. That'll kill your credibility faster than anything else. So it would be a huge mistake. But I think we can overcome the problems of the last few years by doing good work that's reputable and seen to be.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that we've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. So let me turn it over to Alistair.
Joel, thank you very much. And Todd, thanks for the presentation. Quite a few questions. I think it makes sense to start a little bit within GEC and some of the questions about GEC's work and then broaden it out a bit. So you had mentioned a bit about the structure of GEC and the different teams, but Joe Johnson, one of our PDCA board members, asks if you could speak a bit more about the interagency presence in GEC.
Yeah, I wish I could, but I came back. I retired in 2018. I was ill, and I needed a major medical procedure. So I came back, and GEC had started, but it wasn't doing anything public. So when I came back in late 2018, there was no Russia team. We'd had already almost 3 years of it. So I said, look, what can I do by myself? So I just decided to write these dispatches, record what I'd learned. And eventually a Russia team formed, and they liaise with the interagency. But I'm not involved in that, especially since the pandemic. I've got a compromised immune system. I don't want to go to an in-person meeting unless I have to. If it's a classified, it's not going to happen online unless you go to State Department and get on a civets. So I can't comment on that in any depth. I mean, it exists, it's there, it's valuable. How regular it is, I don't know. In the old days, the Active Measures Working Group used to meet every 2 weeks. It was great. There was a guy from CIA posted to state INR, and he would bring 6 or 8 pieces of secret information on active measures, pass it out at the meeting. You double wrap it and take it back to your office, but it gave you real insight, but into what was going on. But on the other hand, we shouldn't make a fetish about stuff being classified. It's wonderful when you get classified information, if it's declassified and you can use it. It's wonderful when you get it and you can't use it, just so you know. But 90% of what you can do with unclassified. And I always did. That's what really counts. The unclassified is by far the most important, except in cases like getting some highly sensitive thing declassified. So, I think the interagency is all well and good, but it's not absolutely essential for 95% of what GEC is doing.
Ambassador Greta Morris had a couple of questions. We'll take one of them first, and then I'll come back to the whole domestic piece of this a little bit later on in the discussion, I think. But she's asking a little bit more about the kinds of disinformation we've seen in connection to the war in Ukraine. Maybe you could talk about that.
Oh, God. I mean, the thing is, and it's great to hear from, I wish I could see everybody, Greta and Joe. It's great to hear from you again. I wasn't keeping up with it. I mean, I was concentrating on what I could do best. What was my value added, which is explaining how to counter it. Lessons learned over 25 years. But the Russians, I mean, it was just, they had a full court press on Ukraine, not just disinformation, but propaganda. And one of the ones we knew about was obvious was they say we've got these labs. Now this lab story goes back decades, okay? And it goes back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where now there's 14 other countries that used to be republics of the Soviet Union, and they've got sensitive military facilities on them, both nuclear weapons and biological weapons. The Soviets had a, full-blown biological warfare program. It was outrageous. And there've been books written by defectors on this. So you had to clean this stuff under control. So DOD, they had a whole, I can't remember the name of it. I wrote a dispatch on it, but the whole program to take care of this stuff. And any threats, any biological threats, nuclear threats, chemical threats, weapons of mass destruction threats that existed. And of course, they played this as saying, oh, these are weapons being, US is, or Georgia, as a lab in Georgia, they've got weapons there. This is nonsense. And this would get played by the Russian Foreign Ministry or the Defense Ministry, within the last year. This is one of their constant themes over the decades. And, there's twisting stuff and relying on fear. That dispatch number 13, I think, talks a lot about this, these fears that people have. Very, very easy to excite fears and suspicions. And that's what they do. So that's one of many, many, many. There was allegations that Ukrainians were trafficking organs, the same stuff pops up decade after decade. But most of it's just, plain old lying about what's going on the ground. And that's getting harder and harder to do when things have shifted so dramatically against.
Maybe broadening things out, but on a similar theme, Sherry Mueller asked me to read her question here about the meeting today. The heads of the Russian and Chinese governments are going to be meeting. Could you talk a little bit about coordination between Russia and China? And maybe I'd add a slight follow-on, sort of any particular differences in approach you might see between the two states' approach.
Well, I can just speculate from what I've read in the press, and I've not seen any classified information on this, I must say. I mean, I'm sure it's out there, but I just didn't have occasion to run across it. But I think they have quite different approaches. I think the Russian one is just totally unscrupulous. They'll say anything, and they're good at it. I mean, they know what buttons to press and how to press them, and they have no problems telling the most bald-faced lies. And the Chinese, I think, they're capable of this. We saw their COVID disinformation. They were naturally defensive. Was it invented, emerged from a lab in Wuhan? And, that's not been answered definitively one way or the other. But they were certainly going to blame the United States, no matter what the truth was. And I would say it was a failing of GEC not to refute that publicly. You can go on the disarming information page. You won't see anything, at least when I checked it a couple of days ago, on knocking down Chinese disinformation on COVID, blaming Americans for bringing it to China, all this nonsense. So this is just another instance of how I think GEC has fallen short. But I think the Chinese are much more into propaganda, and I'm not an expert in this. I talk to people, I read stuff. They're much more into propaganda, and propaganda is about arguable propositions. You say the United States is a bully. Now, we might disagree with that. Some people might agree with that. It's an arguable proposition. So they're going to say, we did great things to save the world from COVID. Whatever, they're going to say whatever they can, twisted logic to make themselves look good and make others look bad. But it's arguable propositions, and you could argue yourself to death on these things. Whereas disinformation is, did they have a lab that was spreading it? Or did we have a lab that was spreading it? There's an actual fact, alleged fact that you can find and hopefully show to be false. That's disinformation, different than propaganda. They're much more focused on propaganda. I think they're more, they're more confident in the long run than the Russians are with their economy, their huge reach, their geopolitical strength. And, they've had, COVID has been a major interruption, but they've had a very impressive rise over the last 40 years. So I would think that they would see that continuing, and they would want people to dance to their tune from now on.
One more question about those narratives and the nature of the problem, and then we'll move on to some questions about what to do about it and who's getting it right and who's not getting it right at the moment. So a question from Pat Kushlis: what are the major disinformation stories you see now as we get close to the November midterm elections here in the US? And it doesn't specify domestic or foreign narratives, so perhaps you could address both based on what you've read and what you know.
Yeah, I'm not paying attention to that. First of all, I'm retired now. Okay, I plan to write a book about this stuff, but it's a book of perspective and lessons, not of what's going on today. I've got, frankly, better things to do in my life than to read RT and Sputnik. And, I've done that enough. And domestically, it's, tremendous divisions in this country, tremendous divisions that 5 years ago or 6 years ago, people really didn't know existed. I think there was not a passivity, but a complacency among the elite. Nobody likes to use that term, I was talking to a friend of mine. He went to Harvard Business School. Oh, I'm not one of the elite. I was an investment banker. I'm not one of the elite. Well, who the hell is if you aren't? But the people who live in Washington are functionally an elite, and there was a huge gap in the perceptions of the elite versus the perceptions of the non-elite or the anti-elite. Sarah Palin was the first, precursor of the rise of the anti-elite, and Trump, personified it in spades. This is who he is. This is his appeal. I think that's much more powerful than disinformation, because he's encapsulating a frustration that tens of millions of people feel acutely, and they've been ignored. And there was a Pew poll, dividing the United States into 9 different types, and one of it is clearly the Trumpists. And these people are, they're now dominant, which they never were. They were always dissatisfied. Now they're in the driver's seat in the Republican Party. Like that kind of stuff is the real problem in our country, not disinformation per se. And I'm sorry I couldn't answer the question more knowledgeably.
Let's turn a little bit more to your proposal about a NED-like organization to work at arm's length from the government on the issue. A couple of questions. Firstly, from Mike Korf. He says, even though private individuals may be able to fight disinformation, is there not a role for government officials as well? And then he says, if not State Department, what about a government entity like the US Agency for Global Media, USAGM? And Joan Maurer has a question along the similar lines. She mentions the Open Technology Fund and housing a counter-disinformation program under USAGM as a separate NGO. So maybe that question about USAGM's role in all of this.
Yeah, I never worked for USAGM per se, but I worked 7 or 8 years at Voice of America. So, and they've got a great role to do by telling the truth. And there's also polygraph.info at VOA, which does a very good job knocking these things down. And look, I'm open. I think that's great if you want to put more emphasis on that. But I'd like to see, I think the measure of effectiveness of any of these organizations is how much ink you get. If you're getting a lot, it doesn't matter if you have 25, 50, or 200 stories on your website. If you're not generating stories in the media, you're not having impact. So I'd like to see something that has impact. And there's no magic formula. I'd like to see it out of state. If you want to juice up Polygraph or something else, that's fine. But I'd like to see product. I'd like to see proof of effectiveness in the terms of media stories. And you see Polygraph once in a while quoted, but I don't see it a lot. Not in, New York Times, not in the major press. So, whatever, I'm easy. I just know State Department has major downsides. And these other organizations, sure, whatever. I'm open to, I don't have a monopoly on truth or insight. I just know it could be done better and it should be done better.
So in terms of doing it better, Nick Cole is on the line here, and I want to turn it over to him to ask a question along those lines.
Okay, hi Todd, good morning. I'm sorry you're not seeing me. The host has disabled my camera, so. Okay, here we go. So what I wonder if you could do is look around the world and see where do you see a bureaucracy that is managing to effectively counter disinformation. I was impressed by how the Foreign Office dealt with that one story about the Novichok poisonings in the UK, simply by tracking all the different things the Russians said about it, and releasing them, which was a true Herb Romerstein move, to just putting all the stuff they say together and completely undermining their credibility. But do you think that they've been able to sustain that kind of output, and who else is doing the job properly?
I think the Lithuanians are doing the best job.
Yeah.
And that was the first dispatch I wrote. I talked to the people there. It's not just the government bureaucracy there. There's a NGO called debunkeu.com. And basically they're a bunch of geeks who are writing algorithms that will capture the disinformation and propaganda about Lithuania. Then they can do a report on it. They also can hand it over to the elves, the volunteer researchers, or very self-motivated, basically work for free as far as I know, and they can research the stuff, and they'll specialize in military, economic, whatever. They become good at something and they stick with it, and then they hand it over fairly seamlessly to all the major media in Lithuania. And the journalists are not going to run everything, but they say, oh, this is a good story, let's do something on this. So there you have a totally integrated operation where, from monitoring to research to countering in the press, not just on a website, it's all being done very effectively and efficiently. And part of that is that Lithuanians know, from sad decades of experience, this problem very close to hand. And Lithuania is 2.8 million people.
Right.
They don't all know each other, but a lot of them know each other, and they can work closely together. So, and you see, there are other people in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, Baltics, who do a good job in their countries, Georgia and whatnot. So, it can be done. It's not impossible, and it just takes commitment and energy, for Christ's sakes. I mean, and being out of a bureaucracy where, it's easy to hide in a bureaucracy, and it's easier to fool your bosses. This is in organizations in general. They say you can fool your bosses a lot easier than you can fool your peers because they see what's going on. So I think it just takes a stripped down, highly committed group of people who open to learning lessons of how it's been done by us in the past and by others, and get on with it. It's nothing more complicated than that.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Looking at other parts of the world, again, for this question from Job Wakesa, who is at the African Center for the Study of the United States in Johannesburg. Would like to know if you've done any work looking at Russian disinformation in other parts of the world, and is it different from Russian disinformation targeting the US? And I think a lot of the stories that you've talked about in the presentation, they're not just involving the US, they're involving stories that have circulated through many different media in many different parts of the world. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I don't know a great deal about that, to be truthful, but it's very important to tackle Russian disinformation in the Arab world. RT's got an Arabic outlet, and in Spanish. And when I had a small counter-disinformation team, that was what I was going to do next. I'm going to hire somebody who spoke Arabic, somebody who spoke Spanish, so they could get on this. But I think you'll find certain themes will circulate centrally, of course, but the propaganda, which is, can be more attuned to specific audiences, whatever they find reasonable, that could vary more. And it'll play on the underlying cultural stereotypes and beliefs. It's very easy to excite anti-American sentiment in Latin America based on, hatred of the Yankee. And in the Middle East, you could play on, anti-colonial feelings or anti-US feelings, especially after the Gulf War. So, this is this is easy for a skilled propagandist to do, really. And the Russians are good at vacuum cleaning up, all the different people out there spewing hate in different languages and putting them on RT or giving them a platform. So, there's people who are just pathetic losers, really, in their own countries, and they're all of a sudden, an important person on RT, representing the Australian point of view. A totally marginal non-entity in Australia is portrayed that way. So I don't have a close-grained, informed bottom line on this. But if you spend your time immersing yourself in this kind of stuff, the patterns become clear. And that's what we need, people who are immersed in the material.
And how can we do more to counter false stories at an early stage? This is a question from Joe Johnson. He talks about how a story might originate in a very obscure outlet on social media, maybe get picked up by an RT, China Daily, those kind of broader outlets, and then it filters its way through. Sort of how can we do more to get to those stories at an earlier stage? And maybe just I'll combine it with Matthew Wallen's question. I think Matthew is from the American Security Project, and he's asking about how we can discourage the US government from being tempted to use some of these same disinformation techniques in reverse to try and counter the narratives that are being put out there. So I'm wondering if those questions you might be able to tackle.
Well, I'll take the second one first, and I've probably already forgotten the first, so you have to remind me. But we don't have to discourage the U.S. government's not doing these kind of things. It would be incredibly stupid to do it, because our credibility comes from being honest. And, what do we have to lose by being honest? Occasionally, if you screw up, people don't want to admit it, but eventually the truth comes out. And so it's best to be upfront and honest. And the stupidest thing in the world would be to try to copy these techniques. And you get stupid people in the government who want to, let's push the envelope. And they inevitably go nowhere because it's very easy to knock them down. So I'd say that's a solved problem. It's not solved forever because the stupid people will reappear ad infinitum, but it's very easy to, just stomp on that point of view. And remind me of the first one, because I can't keep two questions in my mind.
Oh, no problem at all. So talking about countering false stories at the
do it quickly. I think the Lithuanians do that. Sometimes they counter something before it's appeared. That's great. But I think this concern is overwrought. In general, these things tend to be, if it's a good disinformation story, it's like on biological weapons. A lot of people are going to believe it even if you knock it down. So it's not like you got to get it early or you can't stop it. It's going to be there for 50 years. So, you got to remember what you did 10 years ago. So yeah, obviously it's better to knock it down as quickly as possible, as authoritatively as possible, but that's not going to stop it. These things are going to penetrate, and through repetition. They don't care. If they get knocked down, they'll keep repeating it. They don't care. And there's lots of irresponsible people out there who just believe anything. So I think the concern about nipping it in the bud is, it's great if you could do it, but we don't live in a world where things work out so neatly.
One final question. We do have other questions coming in, but I think we just have time for one more, and then I'll pass it over to Sherry. Just again, I think people are very interested in the sort of third-party organization, non-governmental role in all of this. Julianne Palnescu asks, how do you imagine this third-party organization getting the story out to media outside the US, particularly in third world countries, without a direct role of embassy press shops overseas?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's great to hear from Julianne. It's great to hear from a lot of people who ask questions. The word viral is part of our age now. things go viral on social media and in regular media. The baby part story went viral 35 years ago through the media. And it's great to have the public diplomacy shops. But I must tell you, the GEC does not work that closely with overseas posts. I worked very, very closely with overseas posts. Now the GEC mostly works on, let's run a campaign against this kind of thing run by a contractor in cooperation with this post. But there's not the very, very close back and forth between Washington and the Post that we had back when I was working this issue. And, there was an all DAC and all cable to all diplomatic and consular posts coming out on GEC. And I said, let's put in a sentence inviting them to make requests of us. And somebody else said, oh, no, you got to take that. We don't have time for that. Don't have time for that. That was what I did. That was, my mission was to answer post requests and then to collect the stuff and make it available to the press otherwise. So it's a totally different ball game. So I'd love to see the Post, have the Post, but the GEC is not, we're not taking full advantage of them. I would love to see the GEC do a better job. I hope they do. But, I think you need people, if you get something in the press, get something in the prestige press here, it'll play overseas. You get a wire service to run it, go worldwide. So it can be done. Now, USIA was great because you go to PA, they have the connections. They say, oh yeah, call up, what's her name at AP World, get a story out. So, it'd be great to have a press person in a shop. But the bottom line is you got to get the story out. And I agree. The US government still has the best operation on the books, but it's not using it as well as it could, unfortunately. And just one last story. I remember 1991, the Gulf War, first Gulf War. I did a cable to all the posts. Let me know what's going on with Iraqi disinformation. I was getting all this stuff from FIBIS, Foreign Broadcast Information Service, no longer exists. And I did, I think, 9 world nets. You do 3 or 4 round robin, 3 or 4 different embassies in Francophone Africa or Anglophone Africa or Southwest Asia. And the Post, it was great. The apparatus that USIA had was spectacular, both in terms of getting the information to me, along with other parts of the government, and turning it around and getting the information out. And it was a unusually auspicious moment because we were just, there was an air war going on for like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and a propaganda battle because the front lines weren't moving. So it was perfect. And I'd love to see them do it more, but we need more forward-leaning people at state. And I'd like to get them some competition. I used to work for 50 years ago, my misspent youth. I worked for a construction company for a couple of years. And my boss said, whenever he cleared a lot to build a house, he hired 2 bulldozers. The reason he did it was they compete with each other and they get the job done faster than if he hired one. Paying 2, doing 50% of the job each, it was cheaper than hiring one because there was no competition. So I'd like to see the GEC get some competition and get going. And I apologize for overlooking the historical questions, but disinformation's as old as the hills. Misinformation's as old as the hills because it plays on humans' fears, suspicions that are always there, and they're even worse in a rapidly changing world where you have, presidents going off and getting into wars we shouldn't get into. And disinformation, really, that's a question of the apparatus, a state apparatus churning this stuff out on an ongoing basis. That's a huge threat in and of itself, takes advantage of the vulnerability that's already there, but it funnels it for their purposes. And that's where the danger lies. And that's where the focus should be on our countering efforts. Just to apologize for missing that point.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Todd. I think that's a good place to wrap things up, and plenty of food for thought for our future discussions, I hope, among PDCA members on this topic. I'll hand it over now to PDCA co-president Sherry Mueller to close out the program today.
Thank you, Alistair. It's my privilege to express our deep appreciation to Todd Leventhal for his historical perspective and all of the work he's done in this few decades. And I urge all of you to read those 14 dispatches. I've read a few, and they're definitely the right foundation for what we're talking about. And Todd, thanks for getting this series off to a good start. I'm grateful to Joel Fishman, my co-president, as well as Alistair Somerville for conceptualizing this session and the series. And Alistair, grateful for those pre-readings you selected and for serving as primary tech host today. Claudia Del Pozo, our new Hans Tom Tuck graduate fellow, was our backup tech host today. I want to encourage all of you to attend our October 3rd First Monday Forum, which is a celebration of the merger of the Public Diplomacy Association of America with the Public Diplomacy Council. And the October 3rd First Monday is intended to showcase the talents and skills of our members. So special thanks to those of you who've already submitted your 3-minute video. We're grateful. I encourage more of you to do so. The instructions to do so have been in the last few weekly updates, but also will be sent to you as a standalone message. So please be thinking about a moment when you saw or orchestrated excellence in public diplomacy and the lesson that distills for future practitioners. Alistair has kindly promised to provide tech help to those who need it. So we're looking forward to seeing those videos soon. I want to thank you all for your excellent questions, for being here on behalf of the Public Diplomacy Association of America and the USC Annenberg Center for Communication Policy and Leadership. With that, bye for now, and thanks again to everyone here.